That was also an interesting time to be in pest control because if you remember, FIFRA went into effect in 1972. In the early days, the label was not the law.
They had put one of those wavy arm inflatable tube men
Yeah.
on top of the building to keep the seagulls away.
I've seen so much. I've seen how food's produced. I've seen how what I eat, where it comes from, how it's made.
We should not develop a program and go, okay, cool, this is your program in perpetuity.
Then we make our pest control more efficient by focusing on the vulnerable zone.
Welcome to Beyond the Pest. I am your host, Michael Thome.
And I'm Jen Sweeney Ingram, the other one.
Today we had the opportunity to speak with Jeffrey Weier, whose pest control career has spanned over 50 years, longer than I've been alive, Jen.
Amazing.
Wild, right? So just a fountain of knowledge, and we had the opportunity to kind of dig into some pest control, commercial pest control services, and the role that risk assessments play in your overall pest management strategy. So we had a great time talking to him, and we hope you guys enjoyed as well.
Welcome, Jeff. It's good to see you bright and early in Seattle.
It's good to be up bright and early.
Have you had coffee? Are you a coffee drinker being in
Oh,
Seattle?
yeah, I just had a little bit, though.
Well, so you wanted to join us today specifically to talk about risk assessments in the industry, which is a cool topic because actually, Mike, we just mentioned it on the last podcast we did talking about rodents and the importance of risk assessment. But so I guess we can start there because eventually I do want to know the Jeff Weier story.
Okay. You don't want to start with that first, huh?
Well, we can start wherever you want to start.
I know.
Let's start with the Jeff Weier origin story.
Okay. Well, let's see. I've been in pest control since 1973. So I came into pest control like a lot of people did. I was walking up in the biology department at Loyola and looked on the bulletin board. I was looking for a summer job, and there was a ad for a summer job spraying for inchworms in Chicago. So I went over there and applied for it and about killed myself the first, working 20 hours a day and all this kind of stuff. And then I learned the business, that first year. I actually had a pretty good instruction. I didn't get trained by other technicians. I got trained by managers. So I learned the right way to do things. I learned how to do crack crevice applications even back in 1973. So that tells you. That was also an interesting time to be in pest control because that was, if you remember, FIFRA went into effect in 1972. And so that was when everybody was getting licensed. People were still, the process of getting companies and people licensed in FIFRA was just taking place. And so I was kind of at the beginning of that, which is kind of gives me a lot of, I think, a lot of perception into what the industry's gone through. Because, back in the early days, the label was not the law. I mean, and we were still fighting. We were really fighting that back in 73, 74. I mean, we still had USDA labels on products and things like that. So it was good. And so then I worked there, and then I said, well, I'm going to try something different because, pest control, I don't know, it was fun. I enjoyed it, but it was, maybe I started something different, and I kept getting drawn back to it every summer. For a couple of years, I sort of doing summer job, by summer work. And then I started doing some part-time work during the school year. And pretty soon I was managing an office up there. I was working for Rose in Chicago, for Bob Dole over there. And then eventually I after about 10 years, my wife got an opportunity, a job to be transferred to Seattle. So we looked at it and said, well, it's probably going to be much easier for me to get a new job in pest control than it would be for her to get another job. So we took her transfer and came to Seattle. And I kind of, I worked for a supplier off and on for a while when I first came here. And then I met the Tree Levins. And about in 1984, they hired me to come in and be a technician, and with the possibility of being a technical person. And I was perfectly happy because I enjoy being a technician, especially after you've done this for a number of years. A technician is a really comfortable position to be in because you know what to do. could deal with you learn how to deal with clients, and you get a lot of satisfaction from it. I've always felt that you get a lot of positive feedback from customers. You work for them, you do a little extra, you try to work hard for them, you try and solve their problems, and every day people smile at you when you leave. Not everybody, but certainly for the most part, it's a positive experience. So then as I was worked at Sprague for a few years, they wanted to put me into technical director, but they were a small company at that point. So I kind of went to be part-time technical director, which means I ran a route and did technical stuff. But by route, they kept putting me on to the larger food processing clients. And then I try to remember, it was probably almost 1990 before I became full-time technical director. I remember I went to my first Copasan technical committee meeting in 1986, where I met all the gurus of the industry at the time that I was totally impressed by, like Pat Hoddle and Richard Berman and Bill Colby and Earl Hallberg and all these people that are in the annals of history right now. And it was amazing. It was like, that was one of the best groups I was ever in, because I went to that first meeting and we started talking about things like training and documentation, all this different stuff. And I said, oh my God, we have none of this. We're in horrible shape. But then they all helped me. They sent me, people sent me some of their documentation, sent me their checklists, and pretty soon I was able to modify things and bring Sprague into this level. And it was funny because after a few years, I was I was the people at the meetings. They were asking me for this information. The new members were. So it's kind of interesting how that works. So that was there. I became chairman of CTC in 1987. It was a weird thing. Starts a theme in my life that I've been gotten into positions of leadership without being elected. So I've always, somebody had to resign, and they said, "You take my place," and it's like, "Sure, I'll do that." Next thing you know, 3 years later, I'm still chairman. I learned a lot. I got to meet a lot of the owners of the Copasan companies.
Jeff is the Spiro Agnew of the pest control world.
Yeah. No, I was the what was his the guy from Reagan who says I'm in charge now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Nowadays, the UPMDC, we meet by Zoom, but that was an in-person. Was it monthly that y'all met at the Copasan Technical
Oh no,
Committee?
Copasan Technical Committee was a twice yearly meeting.
Where was that held?
In person, around the country.
A different
like
pest company?
UPMTC meetings. We would go to
Mhm.
different universities. We would go to visit different companies, different cities. First one I went to do was in Florida. Then there was one in Denver, and then we were kind of just all over the place. So obviously it's just like UPMTC. Not everybody showed up. I mean, everybody couldn't make it to every meeting, so you just kind of did what you could. And but we got to the habit of trying to go to universities or manufacturers to really learn what's going on in depth in the industry, because you can learn, going to a manufacturer's business, like we went to some of those with UPMTC. You can learn a lot in a day there, more than you can learn at any trade show or anything else. So then, I plugged along at CTC, and I then, one of the things I did I believe it was in the mid 80s, I took some courses from George Okamura. I don't know if you know of George. George was a stored product entomologist in California. He did a lot of work with Capra beetle and different things like that. And he taught me, I learned a lot, and I really fell in love with stored product insects, and I really learned a lot from him. And that's kind of pushed me to my specializing in stored product pests that I do. Then in 1999, I was at the ESA meeting, and Shripot ran to me in the hallway and says, "Hey, we're offering the BCE exam. Why don't you take it?" And I said, "Well, I'm not prepared for it. I hadn't studied for it. I said, just here at the meeting." He goes, "What have you got to lose?" And I said, well, I guess you're right. So, so I went and took the test. I passed the BCE exam there and became a BCE in 1999. That was also a cool conference because that was the ESA meeting where I met E.O. Wilson in the lobby of the hotel and everything else. It was kind
Oh,
of
I'm
a
jealous of that. That's awesome.
fun thing.
So Jeff,
So
when
then,
did you become the full-time technical director at Sprague?
yeah, I don't remember the exact year. It's really kind of, I would say, probably mid 90s, 95, 96.
Okay.
Yeah, in there. But I was, I've always worked closely with clients. I work closely with clients and salespeople, and I've always felt that was a real strength that we brought, that technical people brought to the company, was that we could go with salespeople to a new client and see a problem that they didn't know how to solve or they didn't know what to do, and come up with a solution for it, and then sell the solution. It was kind of, looking back on it, it was kind of bold. Like I would remember taking chances, say, yeah, we'll solve that, and not really knowing what I was going to do, but we just went in there and did it, and we developed a lot of new programs for a lot of different client bases. Certainly in the food processing industry, both food processing, and then into the we had the one paper mill project, which really has started in 1994, and I've been working on that. I was working on that until after I retired, and it was, we really revolutionized how they looked at pest control and that at least that company in the industry.
Tell us more about that. What was revolutionary?
Well, as you know, paper mills are built on rivers. So if you're built on a river, you get a lot of bugs. And of course, they're lit up at night. And so this paper company was along a river in Idaho, and it had, I know there was an article in PCT about this, so it's not like a secret thing. But I went and looked at it and they said, we got to solve this problem. We are losing money. They're shipping to the Japanese, and they were getting their paper rejected, and coming back for cost. They were losing millions of dollars in that one year. And they had a pest control company there, but what they were doing was their solution was to spray the outside of the building. And so they were spraying, and they had power sprayers out there. And if I remember right, they were multiple times a day, up to maybe 8 times a day, they were spraying the outside of the building. They were coming every couple hours and spraying the outside of the building to get rid of the bugs. Well, we all know that spraying the outside of a building is not going to solve occasional invaders flying in, like caddis flies and black flies and those types of things. So we developed a program that relied on monitoring insects inside the building, with the goal of determining where they're entering, because the key is to keep it from coming into the building. So we had to identify all those doors that are being left open, all the holes in the walls, all the different possible entry points. So we put in we said we're not going to spray, and we put in about 175 light traps in this building. And the goal was not to capture all the insects, but obviously everything you capture is one less there. But the goal was to identify where the hot spots were. And so we would go out there every week, and I would go out there as an entomologist every couple of weeks, just during the summertime, to identify where the hot spots were and try to figure out where we could. And they worked really hard with us to close up openings and screen, put finer mesh screens on openings. We built airlocks on some of the doors, so you had to walk through 2 doors to get in, or even trucks driving in, you had to drive through one set of doors, and then it would close, and they'd open the other one to keep the bugs out. So it was really, and within a year, we had them doubt that they were making money on their sales to Japan. So it was, there's obviously still issues, but it was a successful program. That was, well, I felt
Wouldn't it be kind of cool to be writing something on paper and have like a pressed caddis fly on there?
Well, what this was
You would pay extra for that, right?
It's probably
Yeah.
not what was happening, but
This was this is a paperboard that's used for milk cartons and things like that. And in Japan, every person who buys a milk carton, when they're done, they open it up and just look at the inside of it. And if they send it back to the company, the company reimburses them something for if there's a bug in there. So it was a
Oh,
big deal. I mean,
this
it
is a
was.
big story in Japan
This is
then
why the
too.
Canadians sell their milk in bags. You always know what's inside there.
Yeah. No,
So,
it's
Jim, I think that's a great segue into what you're here to talk about, because
yes,
it kind of
exactly.
sounds like, what you guys did there was sort of the beginning of that risk assessment thing. So can you enlighten us a little bit about that? What goes into it? You know what I mean? Like what's the importance of it? I think we kind of understand that, but help us walk us through that a little bit.
Well, risk assessments. I was excited when I first started seeing. What was it about 2000? We had the Global Food Safety Initiative sort of came out with their schemes, and we had worked on this before. I worked with other people trying to develop a system because I actually talking to Bobby Corrigan a lot and working with different things. We looked at rodent vulnerable zones, pest vulnerable zones, trying to identify this concept of can we make our pest control more efficient by focusing on the vulnerable zones, and recognizing that there are situations where the same pest in a different part of a building is a different risk. Um, you can, I mean, rats anywhere are probably a big risk. But if you have ants, on the loading dock of a warehouse, that's not as big a deal as ants inside the packaging area of a food processor. So you can kind of start rating these things as a risk because you can't spend enough time everywhere. There's not enough time or money to do all the things you might want to do to solve the pest problem. So we started working that concept, and that obviously what as you pointed out was fleshed out with the paper company as a risk using a risk analysis. Because the paper company also did lots of other things. We measured lighting. We measured I had contour maps of the lighting densities all over the thing, wind flow, airflow throughout the plant, and everything else to try and identify where the insects are. But in any case, what really came to the risk assessments was one of my large customers came to me and said, "Would you be interested in doing a risk assessment for us for BRC?" And I said, "Sure." So we had a call with one of the BRC people from Great Britain. We're on the call, and he went over with me and them what they thought a risk assessment should include, and that really enlightened me into what a risk assessment was, because one of the big separations I think that we have to deal with is I used to do things called sanitation inspection. We go through a facility and look for every hole in the wall, everything wrong, every little bit of spillage, and you write this big report about it. And a risk assessment is not that. It's not there to identify every little crack and crevice, every little thing that needs to be fixed. Yeah, you do that as part of it, but what you're trying to do is identify what the real risks are to the product. And that's why we really got involved with this BRC gentleman. And then I went and did the risk assessment for this client. And, he mentioned things like, we have to go and look at all the surrounding area. Are there structures around there that could lead to pest problems in your facility? Are there, what's the landscape like? You come in from the outside of the plant to the inside of the plant, and how we can address these and what the highest risks are, and then to address these risks. And so that really, it depends a lot on the product you're dealing with. Some products, they have a very few risk stages. It's kind of related to HACCP in a way. I went through some HACCP training in that time period too, to try to really get an idea, because it really was to me, a form of HACCP. You're looking at the process, where the potential contamination sites are, and what you can do to reduce that or prevent that. So I
So
did that.
for those companies that haven't implemented risk assessment or haven't yet gotten into third-party auditing like BRC, are you using the template that was shared amongst groups like the Copasan Committee, or are you tailoring it to that particular location every time?
All the ones I did were narrative reports. I don't like using checklists. I mean, Sprague does use checklists, and I think there is a certain value for them. I think you start diluting your quality of your report. Risk assessments is supposed to be performed by a pest control expert, and an expert that identifies what needs to be done. And the other side of that coin is that the auditor must accept what that pest control expert says. So if I go in there and say, you only need monthly pest control, until they find a reason why that doesn't work, they need to take that into account. So you have to be careful doing a risk assessment that you're doing, that you're saying, you're specifying things that your client is willing to do. But also the auditors, it really is useful for auditors. I've had auditors that didn't want um, electric heating light traps in some processing areas. And I was able to write an assessment for that area saying that given the risk of the flies, there's less of a risk from the electric heating light trap than there is from flies being in there contaminating the product, and able to get to accept those devices. And you can change your frequency, you can change your and that's where it comes into the rodent control with all the, you can change your device, where the devices are, how many you have, where you might be using non-toxic monitoring blocks versus rodenticide bait. It's going to be extremely helpful in reducing rodenticide around our commercial food processing.
Oh, that's interesting. So you go to the account, you talk with the person, whoever is the person in charge or talking to you about the pest control. They'll tell you our biggest risk right now is flies. But instead of you going around just with a checklist for every single account that needs a risk assessment, you're just observing, correct? A narrative report is just you're taking the time inside, outside, and then kind of coming together at the end and thinking
And
through
writing up a report. Yes.
yeah.
I use
Mhm.
I use any data they can provide for the past trap catches from the previous years, or rodent or insect activity, to do that. And then I come up with a plan. I come up with a pest management. Is the plan that they currently have in place adequate? If not, what needs to be changed? And then from year to year, we come back, we might go there and say, well, last year I thought this was a problem, but this turns out this is not, but this other area is an area. So you want to be very flexible with it. And I don't do as many anymore as I used to since I retired, but we've trained people within the company to do it. But that's how I kind of developed this whole concept of risk management. And I took it into another area. I took it into was the fisheries industry in Alaska. And I've done a lot of assessments up there, and really changed a lot of the way that they look at some of their pest control up there in those remote, massive processing plants up there, which can be a real challenge in some of
Walk
those.
us through that. That sounds interesting.
Yeah. Well, I started that in I think 2014. I got a call, and they wanted me to know if I could be in Dutch Harbor tomorrow. And I said, well, maybe not quite tomorrow, but anyway, so I went up there, made my way up there. And I was doing a assessment on a factory trawler ship. So there's factory trawlers where they those big nets, they pull the fish in, and they do all the processing, and the fish come in the back end of the boat, and a week later they have blocks of frozen fish coming out the front end of the boat. And it's a big business up there. There's lots of these things working, and they were first trying to get BRC certified for these. And so I did the first risk assessments on those boats. And I've been doing those for a while, but then once I started doing the boats, they got me involved with the shore plants, which were a little bit different. The boats, you don't have a lot of rodent issues. You have some fly issues, but you're up in the Arctic, so you don't really have a lot of flies. So it's not a huge amount of pest issues. But in the on the shore plants, they have there could be rodent activity, there could be eagle activity causing problems. You have sea otters. You have just everything coming into these plants causing issues, and you have to deal with it, and with all the regulations and everything. So it's been a learning experience for me. I learned a lot about the industry, because, as you know, one of the things you'll learn when you're in the commercial business, when you take on an industry, you start working in it, you learn a lot about that industry. You become much more knowledgeable and competent when you're doing it for a while than
Right.
when you first start.
That's one thing. we had an account at my last company. It was the meat packaging, and the seagulls were such an issue. So that's one thing that we don't talk too much on this podcast about, or haven't yet, is bird control. But I remember this one in particular was funny to me because they had put one of those wavy arm inflatable tube men
Yeah.
on top of the building to keep the seagulls away, and they just, were circling it and didn't bother them at all.
Well, it's interesting. You go up to Alaska, and the bald eagles are the seagull. So more bald eagles than seagulls in some of these places, and they use a lot. They've used it from the old DVDs hanging from wires to the little plastic strips, and they actually work fairly well for them. It's interesting because some things don't work as well up there as they do down here, and you got the eagles and ravens up there, plus you got seagulls, of course. Not as many pigeons for most of those facilities, but it's just a little bit different world, and I enjoy it because I get to see things and do things that I wouldn't normally do. Um, learning how to get in and out of Alaska is a real skill you need to develop. It's not as simple as buying it. You think you buy a plane ticket, like I did my first time up there, and you think you get on a plane and leave, and it doesn't always work that way. In fact, more times than not, it doesn't.
So Jeff, I'm operating under the assumption that you don't treat your risk assessments as a one and done kind of thing, right?
No.
Over time, things change. So what do you have like a frequency that you recommend to go back and kind of reevaluate and maybe even like redo that risk assessment?
Well, I try most of my regular customers I do them annually.
Okay.
So we do them every 12 months. We do a risk assessment, and that's kind of what's specified by the Global Food Safety Initiative schemes. And you need to do that because things do change. You're supposed to go back, although this doesn't always happen because of the expense. When something changes at the facility, they could. I have done assessments where I've done virtual ones after in between to try when something's come up that's been really serious. Taking care of that, but yes, you need to. They're not a one-time thing because the risk changes. There's repairs done, there's maintenance done, there's remodeling done at these facilities. They might even change what they're processing. I go to these fish plants. They will suddenly they're processing a whole different type of animal, and you just never know. And you need to really evaluate what happens, and things really do change.
Jeff, have you mostly your pest control career worked in the commercial side? Did you work in the residential side as well?
I did residential for the first 10, 12 years. When I first worked in Rose in Chicago, we were a combination. And then when I came to Seattle, Sprague still had a fairly large residential business, when we were smaller back in the 80s. But we made a decision when I was part of the management team. We got together other people on the team. And we decided that the commercial was the way we wanted to go and move away from residential into commercial because of the consistency of it, the year-round flavor. Up where we're at, year-round pest control, the companies would shut down basically from November through February because there really wasn't much to do unless you're in the commercial business. And so we were able to, that we did that to keep our staff, not have to lay off staff and hire new staff. And there's lots of reasons for it, but it's more complicated. It's also a business where I feel that technical people like ourselves are more valuable in the commercial end of it than they are in the residential, because honestly, a good person who's been trained as a technician and has his own company can do a really nice job for most residential customers. But when it comes to the commercial, they start falling apart. All the things, the paperwork, the dealing with auditors, dealing with the different unusual pests you have. All those things can become issues.
Yeah, I was curious because I've never heard of a risk assessment talking about residential customers, but I wonder if anyone is doing that or if it's more of a formal thing or more of an informal
Well,
thing. Have you heard of it?
I have not heard of that, but most of the thing with risk assessments is, we tried to push them once I started doing them, and we found out that there was a market for them. But it turned out that at that point in time, back in like 2015, 16, 17. Um, the BRC and SQF were not pushing risk assessments to the customers. They were suggesting them, but not requiring them. Now they're kind of requiring them. So that's been in their standards from the beginning, but they're now starting to require them. So I think it's more of a market out there for it than there was in the past.
I think that's a good point. I think, these things extend beyond just food processing, right? I spent a good chunk of my career working in the healthcare industry, doing pest control in healthcare facilities. And we would regularly conduct a risk assessment for that facility. There's a certifying body called ASH that does like contractor training for working in healthcare environments, and that was a piece of that. But we would conduct risk assessments based on down to the floor of the hospital. What kind of patients were being seen? Do you know what kind of materials can we apply in these spaces? And I think it's the risk extends beyond just the pest. The risk also extends to like, what are we as applicators applying in those situations?
Absolutely.
And what would those applications,
Yeah.
go towards the patients or the product or whatever it is that we're working, right?
Yeah, I think that's a very good. I've never done one in a hospital or help like that, but I do see the value of those, and I have done some for pharmaceutical companies assessments, because they're very, very, very sensitive to insect pests. I mean, people think that food plants are sensitive, but go into a pharmaceutical manufacturer, and I remember the first time I went to one of the big ones. I was meeting with them, and they said, we've had a bad spider problem we have to deal with. And I said, okay, well, how many are you catching? And we said, we had 13. And I said, is that in a month? They go, oh, that's the year. So I sat back in my seat and said, oh, okay.
Wow.
You have to kind of adjust we're so used to, I think, a lot of times walking in and, everyone has tolerance levels and thresholds, but you get into these pharma customers and their thresholds, their tolerance levels are like one instance,
Yes.
right? And all of a sudden you have to develop an action plan for it. So
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
Not to mention the look of your technicians as well. If you have hospital accounts, you might not want your technicians walking through with large sprayers and interior, discreet sometimes is best.
Yeah, I mean, that's all, I want to go back to your comment, Michael, on the pesticides you can use, because that is a key thing. There are certain areas where you can't do something in the area. You can't treat in some processing areas at all. So you're going to have to deal with building that pest out from the outside. So that's something that's, you have to take into account. That really, you need I think you need a lot of knowledge to do a risk assessment. I mean, they want a professional, generally a BCE, ACEs are accepted these days and everything, but it really needs to be a person who can, because you need to be able to defend your judgments. If you come in and say, I think this needs to be done this way or that way, and either doesn't like it, or something, a pest crops up, you have to be able to defend and be able to modify what you've said to take that into account.
Have you run into a lot of scenarios where you've had to stick to your guns about what you think needs to happen?
Sometimes, but I'm my career, I've been pretty good about negotiating with people and keeping, they're our customer. The customer's always right, and the customer needs to get what they want. And you can tell them, and you can try to convince them, but I've always looked at it as saying, well, I really think I'm right here, but what if I'm not? And
That's a healthy mindset to have.
yes, because when people want to change something, I've had customers who say, we want to change, they get into this rodent control stuff, say we want to remove, 2/3 of our rodent equipment. And I'm like, well, the data may kind of show that, but there's reasons for having that stuff there, even though it doesn't capture or doesn't show signs of activity. And maybe we should start with 30% or something rather than 2/3. And we can work it that way through, because people do get carried away and somebody's going to go to a conference and they'll hear somebody give a talk about how, oh, I only put 2 bait stations out now, and that solved all the problems in this 500,000 square foot warehouse. And it's like, well, maybe not. I have this concept I've been trying to formulate more into this idea that 0 is a number. 0 is not nothing. that the fact that you have road devices or insect devices that don't capture anything doesn't mean there's nothing there. So you have to look at that's just a data point that you look at. So I think we sometimes put too much emphasis on this as zero. Oh yeah, I went to the place. I've been servicing it for 6 months. And haven't seen a thing. It's like, well, maybe there is nothing there. Maybe there's not, but we still need to keep monitoring. I've had people come to me and say, well, we could cut the number of pieces of equipment down to like 1 or 2 around the building. Because look, based on our data and based on stuff. And I said, but what about, you have to always monitor areas that you have never had any activity just to make sure. You can reduce your monitoring to a smaller amount and use non-toxic blocks and all these or electronic sensors, all these things, but you can't eliminate stuff just because it had no activity.
I think that, it's funny that you brought that up because I just had a spirited conversation with a colleague not too long ago about, when we're looking at devices that we have and we have zero activity, should that spur you to physically remove those from the place? Where my point was, I don't want to remove them. There's still a monitoring device. There's still a control measure, right? But maybe we don't need to service them every week. You know what I mean? Maybe we look at the frequency that we're servicing
Right.
those devices. But to your point, like if we have bait stations on the exterior of a facility and we're not getting feeding, then why do we have rodenticide in there? Let's maybe put a
Yes.
monitoring bait inside there. We inspect those once a month, and then when we have activity, it spurs some sort of action. But to your point, Jeff, zero is still a data point, right? And it
Yes.
should still spur us to some kind of action. Anything we catch, any evidence of activity is a data point, or lack of activity is a data point that should be spurring us to make decisions or changes in our program based off of that.
Correct. I absolutely agree. Yeah, we did that same analysis looked at road bait stations. We looked at them through our records, and look at all our stations that have had zero feeding for more than 2 years, and the facility they're outside of had no internal captures. And we came up with tens of thousands of pieces of equipment that fit that criteria. And those are the ones where that was our goal, was to look at going to the non-toxic monitoring blocks, and the sensors. The sensors are, I've been a big advocate of the rodent sensors for a long time. I started in 2000. I had some real early ones from that they sent me from France that used a Palm Pilot to read them. So that tells you how old they were. But I've never. I'm just disappointed at this point that we don't have companies that come up with reliable, robust sensors that are affordable in these systems. I was so excited. I pushed to get these out there, and I met with all the players, and we get them out there, and they wouldn't work. They wouldn't connect. They give all these false readings, and then they wanted to charge us more for the sensors, and then we receive for the whole account. So anyway, I don't want to bash the sensor companies. They're trying, but
Certainly.
yeah.
When you're going to these accounts, especially a large facility, are you right off the bat recommending remote monitors or
No.
Other sorts of devices like that?
No,
Okay.
I don't recommend remote. My personal feeling, and I would love it if they worked, but I don't think they work well enough to be relied upon today. Maybe I'm sure some getting better out there. And since, I didn't go to Pest World this year to see the latest iterations of everything, I don't know what's going on with that, but it's, I'm trying to get us to use like to use less rodenticide, but is a real key. We dispose of so much rodenticide, and that's uneaten or barely touched, and I think that's ridiculous. It's potentially causing us these problems. I mean,
Well, yeah, and at some point you need to check the bait. It goes bad, and
yeah,
so a lot of these companies, our manufacturers are working to make it more weather resistant. But, every 3 to 6, I don't even know. By my standard, I typically say every 3 months, look, you need to see if the bait's still good. What do you think?
well,
Can it
you
go
need
longer?
to look at it, yes. Um,
Yeah.
changing it's a different issue. I have seen companies say, well, we change our bait every month. It's like, what a waste. I mean, that stuff's good for a year or more out there, unless it's wet or extremely, there's something else feeding on it. Rodents will consume this stuff. It's palatable for a long period of time. So the idea with rodenticide, to me, we spend a lot of time and effort putting rodenticide into tamper-resistant bait stations. How much time do we spend analyzing and making purchasing decisions on bait stations, how they're secured and how the bait's secured inside there, what we look at and everything else. And then when we decide to get rid of the bait, we toss it in the trash can. And that bait, in my mind, becomes feral at that point. It's no longer
I like
domestic.
that.
We don't have any control over it.
I like that.
Yeah. And that's, I
Very
think,
true.
how much of our problems are being, unfortunately, I don't want to have strenuous disposal requirements for rodenticide because that causes us lots of issues. But I think we need to look carefully at where we use rodenticide. Anyway, we're using that we're tiering our rodenticide into, we got the non-toxic monitoring, we got snap traps, we've got less toxic actives, more toxic actives, and we tier it so that we are moving through a process. And that's kind of goes back to the risk assessment. There's a process that maybe we're not using the most toxic products we have until we've gone through a series of steps. And then, so that ends up, we're reducing the total amount put out there.
I think it kind of ties back to what you said about redoing that risk assessment on an annual basis. Now I have a year's worth of data, right?
Yep.
So oftentimes when we take over a new customer, regardless of who it is, I want my own data. I don't necessarily, because look, at the end of the day, we all know that our data comes from if our technicians put good data in whatever, handheld unit they're using, right? We get good data out, right? But, to have a year's worth of data and look back and say, okay, I can make an even more informed decision or a better informed risk assessment. Now that I have a year's worth of data to look at, I can, kind of, use seasonality in that. Do we need to make changes, at different times of the year? For example, I live in Cleveland, right? We don't get a whole lot of fill fly issues in December and January, right? So I can make modifications on my fly control strategies based off of, kind of that thing. So having some sort of cadence where you're redoing that risk assessment, you're looking at it, year over year to make changes and alterations. Ideally, like we talked about before, our pest control programs are living things. They should not be stagnant. We should not develop a program and go, okay, cool, this is your program in perpetuity, right? There are environmental factors. There are changes to buildings. All these things change, and we need to adapt with them.
It's difficult to do that. And also, we're talking about rodents a lot, but also it applies to stored product pests. And like you said, flies. I mean, there's a lack of analysis goes on with, like I look at fly light traps, and we'll go into a warehouse. There's one trap that's always full of flies. And you look at it and say, well, where is this trap? And it turns out it's right next to the door where the truck drivers come in with all their papers. So that's the door. Everybody's constantly coming in and out that door. So of course, is that an issue? No, it's not. We don't need a response to that necessarily. We need to just be aware of it and watch the other traps in the other areas. Pheromone traps, the same way. We do, pheromone trap captures are cyclical. If you're doing Indian meal moths or anything else, you're going to get cyclical during the year activity. And it might be cyclical based on the product. When the product's harvested and brought in, it might be the product might be brought in during the June, July period, and the moths are growing during the September, October period. Then the weather gets cold and they drop off. And you need to look at this and understand how you're going to respond to these things based on all those captures. And I think that's something that's really important. And in my risk assessments, I try to do that too. Talk about, is this important and why? This trap showing increased counts, but it's not significant based on, my observations in the area or whatever.
What's been oh, one of the or just a rewarding experience that you've had in some of these accounts? I know you mentioned the paper mill, but are there any others that kind of stick out in your mind where when you think about why you love pest control,
Oh yeah,
jump out?
I've worked in several industries, commodity groups, where I've been able to come up with different solutions, like the paper mill. To now some of these are a little more confidential, obviously, but more, how you attack the problem. My One of my feelings always was I wanted to be in pest control, but I don't want to just rely on. I want to be a sprayer. It's that's I've learned very early on that spraying is not the permanent solution to pest problems. It's part of your tools. It's sometimes we need it as a temporary solution. You have outbreak of beetles in a food storage. You got to do something. You can't just let them, wait for them to die off. But long term, you have to find out what the source of the infestation is, why it's there, and then deal with that. So yeah, I've had some very satisfying ones with some industries where they've had ongoing problems for years. We've been able to come in and take a little different approach. Not a dramatic. I mean, it's not. I used to go into years ago when I went to Purdue every year. One of the things I do whenever I was in a new commodity group, I would go to the library and spend a day or two in the library looking up all the stuff I could find, literature I could find about that commodity group. So I'm in with coffee and I read Portuguese journals on coffee and different things like that. But you become an expert. You start learning as much as you ask your customer, and they'll always share with you. And you can then come up with a more rational. I guess we're bringing that term back. I heard biorational, but we had that a long time ago. More of a rational approach to these things, where it's like, okay, you use a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and you use things that are most effective. And sometimes using a more toxic, if you will, or hotter product in a small amount is better than trying to use a less hot product, but using more and more and more of it. So I think there's a lot to be, and it's all involved with risk. Risk is everything. Um, you're risking if you're like you said, if you're in a hospital, if you're in a daycare center, you have a risk with anything you do there. So you have to make a decision: do we need to act on this at all, or can we put up with a larger number of this pest than we can in an aseptic environment in a food processing?
So I think my takeaway from talking to Jeff today is that if you want to have a career in this industry that spans, I don't mean this disrespectfully, Jeff, my entire lifetime, you have been in this
50 plus
industry.
years. Yeah.
Yes, right, longer than not too many more years I've been alive, but more than that. That not only do you have to be a pest control or an expert in what we do, you have to be an expert in what our customers do as well.
Yes. If you walk into a plant, I've learned this. I walked in not knowing a thing and kind of just questioned my way through it. But also after that, you walk in and say, "Oh, you produce whey here. Well, what about this? What about that? You're doing a dry process. Have you ever had this type of pest? And have you ever had this issue come up? And what's your shipping schedule?" And I know normally this stuff goes out on a certain time of day in most operations. How does yours do? You start throwing out some of the little bits and pieces that you picked up over the years, you build a lot of credibility with the client.
I think that's a great idea before you head out to an account of industry that you're unfamiliar with. Read up before you get out there.
Yep. See, easier
Make
now with the
sure.
internet than it was when I was doing this early.
Well, yes, but I'm sure what you picked up in encyclopedias in the actual library was fascinating, and I'm sure you remember still some of those tidbits to this day.
Oh yeah, it's fun. I mean, learning is fun, but learning,
We certainly have a passion for it.
yeah, learning and being able to go into a place and I remember I took my family once to a cheese place, and that the tours were down. I was like a walking tour. I was able to give them a tour and explain all the equipment because I'd worked in cheese plants for so many years. I knew what everything did. Didn't tell them which one had the bugs in it, but
Well, you probably got some more free samples.
yeah. You go to a brewery and you know where to immediately where to go to look for the bugs. I mean, just to know. what's going on. But yeah, I think that's what I would recommend is that, and that's been the joy of it. If you ask what was a joy to me was learning about this. I feel like I know so much now. I've seen so much. I've seen how food's produced. I've seen how what I eat, where it comes from, how it's made, what processes take place. And, people always ask you, have you ever seen how sausage is made? And I go, yep, I sure have. Have you? It's like,
I've always wanted to go to a pet food facility. Something or,
no, you
those
don't.
kinda it'd be good.
No, you don't.
Like, so you don't want
No, you
to,
don't. You
but
don't want to go there.
because
Especially a
it's
wet one.
less
Yeah.
regulated,
Yeah.
you know, I would wonder what I would make a plan what my plan would look like for a facility like that.
When you get, I was, I go to one plant. I was going to this dried plant I eat all the time. They had the boxes of powdered chicken, you know, and then they had the other stuff. But you think when you go to these commercials on TV, they show you, oh, we have salmon and shrimp and everything else in our dog food, and it's like, yeah, but when you go to their freezers, there it looks a little bit different. It's not the parts they're showing you on TV that they're putting out. I mean, they grind it up and cook it. I mean, it's okay for an animal. I mean, fine. It's okay for a human probably, but it's
Not the filet.
it's not the fillet. No.
Like, if you've ever been to a chicken processing plant and you've gone to the awful building, the
Yes, I have.
OFFAL building, right? That is when they say, uh, usually it says like chicken meal byproduct is a list in
Yeah.
your thing. The stuff that comes from there is what ends up. Do you know what I mean? So
Yeah.
it's funny you said the what goes in the sausage. There's a guy named Upton Sinclair that wrote a book
Right.
called The Jungle. It was actually a series of articles, right? So yeah, that if anybody's ever interested, it's a pretty good read. It was the formation of a lot of our Meat Inspection Act stuff,
Yeah. The
and
jungle
it all
is
kind of
good. Yes.
it
Yep.
ties back to controlling rodents in those. I think it's funny. If I remember correctly, he said something along the lines of, "I aimed for their stomachs and hit him in the heart," or "I aimed for their heart and hit him in the stomachs." Is actually, I think, what he said about that. But yeah, it's a good read.
Yeah.
So
One of the first things my first years in pest control, we were doing a fumigation down in this old stockyards in Chicago, and I was walking by this room, and there were all the animal hides stacked in there, and there were rats crawling all over them. It's kind of a shock for me as a young kid at that point. It's a 19-year-old or 20-year-old, whatever I was at that point. But yeah, you learn. But yeah, the
Yeah, sounds
awful,
like
awful places are really awful.
you don't say. We need T-shirts. Well, what else, Jeff? Thank you so much for hopping on today. I love hearing these stories. It's just my favorite part of
Well,
doing
I wasn't
it.
sure what you were looking for exactly, but I wanted to tell my story, and I think people are always interested in how you get into the industry, and most people I know, a lot of people I know, don't target this industry. We get into it by accident, and then once we're in it, we can't get out. We don't want to get out.
yeah, look, the only people that I know that grew up wanting to, or I mean, I don't want to say grew up wanting to, but unless your folks own a mom and pop pest control company, you know what I mean? There's not a lot of people that get exposure to what we do early on,
Yep,
right? It comes either from the academic kind of way, you know what I mean? That
yep,
that, that you come up through the academic way, or you kind of know somebody who's in it and you kind of fall into it, and you either love it or like 2 days in, you're like, nope, this is not
yeah.
for me.
When I always,
So
as I always thought to myself, it's like, what I loved about it was I was on my own. Every day was different. I was driving somewhere. I was going maybe to a different, maybe the same facility, but every day was a little bit different. You're seeing different things and doing different things. And there are people that don't like that. We've hired people that's like, oh, I like working in a warehouse where I can just go to the same place every day and drive my forklift every day. And that's fine. It's to each their own. But I was always amazed that somebody didn't like the flexibility and the yeah, flexibility works both ways. I mean, you get to take time when you need it, but you also have to sometimes work when you don't want to work. But that's life.
Yeah, constant adaptation in our industry, that's for sure.
Yep.
And to come on around FIFRA is really interesting. Was there anything that stood out to you? I know it was right as you were starting, but do you remember kind of the feelings of those around you or your bosses and how they were kind of tightening things up? Or navigating that?
They, didn't. They're following the rules, but I remember seeing the DET roped off in the back rooms, and everything else because could do anything with it at that point. The biggest issue was that back before that, when you bought a bottle of chlordane, you could do whatever you wanted with it. Basically, you could spray anything you wanted. Whereas once FIFRA went to play, when the labels started coming out, you could only follow the label, and that was a tough thing for people to change because they said, "Well, I always use chlordane for this. This is how I use it," or Dursban or whatever it was. Those are the old time products, but that was a big difference. That was the tough. It took years to get that adaptation into place.
Fascinating. Thank you so much, Jeff. Any other things that we didn't touch upon today that you wanted to talk about?
Oh, I'm sure I'll think of something, but I think we covered a whole lot. So
Yeah, there's decades of material.
Yep. Yeah, we could talk about individual things at some point, but that's
Awesome. All right, Jeff. Well, thanks so much, man.
Thank you, Jeff. Have a great
Thanks,
day.
Jeff.
You too.
Appreciate it.
Bye.